Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. It's been quite a long time since we had a course webinar, so welcome, and it's nice to have you after such a long time. My name is Furupero Tambani, and I am the Science Communication Specialist for the NSCF. And today we are going to talk about access, something that is touch and go. Some people are yes, some people are no, but today we're going to see what standards are there in terms of access. We will be taken through today's webinar by Michelle Hamer, for those who might not know her. But Michelle is the NSCF lead, and she's going to take us through today's presentation. But before we get to Michelle, we just need to go through the webinar guidelines, just so that everyone knows what to do and what to expect. So we ask that you keep your contributions helpful of everyone in the room, whether it's the hosts or other participants. Let's just respect each other and be considerate of each other. And you can use the chat box to say hello and let us know which institution you're coming from. I see, because we are used to this tradition, we already have started. So thank you to everyone who has already started to greet. It's our heritage, right? Being African, you get to a room and you have to greet whoever you find there. So Chantal, thank you for getting us going. Chantal is from ARC-PHP. We also have Maxine from the NSCF. We have Sfiso, also with the NSCF. Henry, Jermaine, Maggie, Aisha, Geraldine, Charlene. Charlene is from the Bowlers Herbarium. Nice to have everyone. Please, for those who haven't greeted, please go ahead and greet everyone in the chat box. And then when you find that you have a question regarding the webinar, regarding access, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box and we will get them answered. If we don't get them answered due to time constraints, then we'll make sure that we answer them. Please make sure that you add them to the webinar link. Whether on actually today, it will only have to be on YouTube once we upload the recording, because we're having trouble with Facebook today. You can also keep your eye on our website, on the collections management page. That's where we keep all recordings, all notices about the course, and even the slides, the presentation slides that are shared. So you can just go there at any time and you'll find all the information there. Now that we have all that done, we can get started with the actual webinar, and Michelle will get us going. Michelle?
All right, thank you very much, Fulu, and good morning and welcome everybody to our webinar. So today we are covering quite a big chapter in the manual, and it's about access. We're going to talk a little bit about what do we mean by access and open access, and then also look at some of the policy guidelines for access, talk about decision-making for access requests, think about visitors, loans, election data and specimen images, because there's also access related to those, and then also destructive sampling requests. So if you have looked at the manual, you'll have seen that there's a lot of detail about different processes and how to do different things. And we're not going to go and repeat all of that today. This is really just to cover some of the main sort of policy guidelines and requirements for dealing with access. So access is something that is a requirement for the institutions that are participating in the NSCF. It was one of the requirements that the Department of Science and Innovation that funds the NSCF It was one of the things that they said. So collections and specimen data are considered as research infrastructure, and we funded under a research infrastructure program. And this meant that institutions had to open their collections, make them accessible, and their data to be eligible. So the purpose of most of these collections, most of the collections that we have as a community, are there to serve the research community. And this, in most cases, includes researchers from other institutions outside of the host institution, and that's both in South Africa and internationally. So that's the purpose of research collections, is to serve the research community. If collections and data are not widely used, they really have little value other than to one or two people. And then it becomes very difficult to justify spending very scarce government or taxpayer funding on staff. So it's going to become harder and harder to justify that investment unless the collections are widely used. Collections that are regularly used by researchers outside the institution, they have high value to the research community, and they play a very important role in contributing to building knowledge. And that knowledge helps to protect our biodiversity, it enhances livelihoods, it helps us to understand climate change impacts, disease spread, all kinds of important aspects. And it also just increases our curiosity about our natural heritage and also our appreciation. So the more widely used or accessible a collection is, the more value it has. So providing access is really a big part of the work of natural science collections. It's one of the main tasks of the staff who manage and care for the collections, and one of the main functions of the institutions that have collections. It's a big part of the work. So I thought I'd just show some figures. The NSCF has just had an external review by the Department of Science and Innovation. And some of you will know that through Chanel, she coordinates the outputs from all the institutions. So we keep track of it. And these are the totals for the last 5 years, just to show how much the collections are used by external researchers. So this is across the different institutions. So there were 91,000 specimens sent out on loan over 5 years, 3,600 odd tissue or DNA samples supplied, over 5,000 visitors using the collections, and that was national, and nearly 900 international visitors using the collections. A lot of data requests, so nearly 1,500 data requests, and over 2 million records provided to external users. So you can see that the level is very high, the level of use. And papers published, so over 1,000 papers published from using the collections, and over 900 new species described. So very high levels of use, which is great. Okay, and this, I don't know, for some reason the data is not showing, but what we also did is we looked at GBIF. So quite a few of the institutions have made some of their data, and some have made all their data accessible on the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And there it's openly accessible. Nobody has to request it. Anybody can download anything they like. And you can actually track the number of times any of those records have been downloaded. You can track the number of citations. And it showed when we did this, Ian pulled out the figures from GBIF and wrote codes to do things, but the number of downloads for some of the data sets is also very high. It's like 20,000 times somebody's used some of those records. So that's just those figures. And if you want, you can go and look at what's in GBIF, and you can and see your institution, and you can see how many times the data have been used. So, you know, we've said that it's a requirement that the collections, the data are accessible outside the institution. We promote open access. DSI promotes open access. But that usually triggers a very strong negative response in people. Open access doesn't necessarily mean that there's no restrictions on access and use. So there are certain, it's not free for all. Anybody can have anything they want, to do anything they want with it, or anyone can come in and do whatever they like. When, in terms of the collections, there has to be a balance between the use and ensuring the long-term sustainability of the specimens. So it's balancing those two things, using but also protecting. Data, it can be accessible, but sometimes there's a need to restrict access to some detail. So often the coordinates or locality details, because that might cause harm to populations, and that's especially for threatened species. And then there have also been some calls when the working groups and the coordinating committee have met to discuss access and developing an access policy guideline for the NSCF institutions. There were some calls made to restrict access to some specimens or some data sets, especially when they're newly collected specimens, because somebody might be actively working on them. And that's often a postgraduate student. So they might have collected a whole lot of material. It comes into the institution and they don't want it to be accessible until they finish their study. And that's a fair request. So the principle that we work by and that you can always think about is as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So when is it really necessary to close access? And only when there's a good reason do you close access. So how does an institution balance promoting access to the collections, promoting access to data, but then also thinking about the rights of researchers who might have collected material and be working on it, protecting vulnerable species, sustainability of the collection. So you've got to try and balance all of those. And this is where it's really important to have an access policy for your institution. So after lots of debate and discussion, the NSCF coordinating committee did agree on a set of guideline points. And these are, it's not a lot, it's about 5. So the kinds of policy statements that you can have: access must be provided openly without charge to bona fide researchers. And I've put and students in brackets because there's some limitations for students. There might be limitations on access for protecting species, protecting research in progress, limiting impact on the scientific value of the specimens or the collection, or not putting the institution at risk. And when we say putting the institution at risk, an example there would be if you have rhino horn in your collection, do you want people to know about that and make those data openly accessible? There's a risk to the safety of the staff and the security of the institution. Then another policy point is to say something about that the institutional procedures must be adhered to, including authorizations, and access must be legally compliant. So there's a lot of permitting issues around providing access, even for loans. So export permits might be required. There's issues around passing on material to a third party, and that's especially for data, for images, for tissue samples. Can they pass it on to somebody else? There's issues around benefit sharing when you don't giving somebody tissue samples or DNA extracts. And then there's SARA permits, the Heritage Council requirements for sending any type specimens overseas. Even on loan, you have to get a SARA permit. So everything should be done legally, in compliance with the legal requirements. And so your access policy can be very short, just covering these kind of statements, and that access policy should be on your institution's website. So it's very clear what your policy is. So the policy statements are broad and high level, but then you need the detail to help provide guidance to staff who have to make decisions. So these would be a separate document. It can be an annexure to your access policy or a separate document. And you need to have decisions about, can you send holotypes out on loan? So I think the working group, when they were developing the access chapter for the manual, there was lots of debate about this. I think the general thinking is no, you shouldn't send a holotype out, but there may always be a case where you do. Do you send out paratypes or isotypes? Are visitors allowed to handle the type specimens? Can you dissect the types? What proportion of the specimens of a species can go out on loan? I think the recommendation in the manual is 50%, no more than 50% as a maximum. And this is especially important for rare species. You might only have 5 specimens of something. Will you send them all if they're requested? Do you allow subsampling, so tissue removal of type specimens? Is it different for holotypes and paratypes or isotypes? Do you send loans to postgraduate students? I think the recommendation is that it should go to the supervisor, not to the postgraduate. Do you send to non-researchers? So if it's a citizen scientist or a consultant, would you send to them? Do you allow loans to be sent to private homes? There was lots of debate about that issue. I know the herbaria are very strict and they'll only send a loan to another herbarium, but for the museums and the zoology collections, it's different. Do you allow your specimens to be sent on loan for exhibits? Which are the criteria for that? Are staff allowed to take specimens home on loan to work on them in the evenings and on weekends? Now, during lockdown, what did you do? Can they take specimens to another institution for study purposes? How do you know if a researcher is working on a particular group or set of specimens or data? And how long can they keep the specimens out of circulation or inaccessible before making them available? What are your rules for data requests, for requests of images of specimens? Can requesters pass the data and images on to others? Can they share them? Can they publish them on GBIF or to another data repository? So this is where the difficulties are in the details, and you should have clear, very clear standard access standards or guidelines for people who have to make the decisions. So we're going to do a poll. We like to get people's input, and these are some difficult examples. Maybe they're not for you, but the kinds of access requests, sometimes it's simple, but sometimes it's more tricky. What would you do if you got a request for a small fragment of herbarium specimens for 182 species with 6 duplicates of each for DNA analysis? So you can see a huge number. And this is a PhD student at a local university who's asking you to subsample your herbarium specimens. Then there's another request here, all the type specimens for a bat genus to be sent on loan to a researcher at a museum in the USA. What would you say? Yes? No? Then someone asks for toe pad clips. So this is where they cut the tissue, a bit of tissue from the bottom of the foot, the toe pads, for all the Cape Parrot specimens in your collection. And this is for a forensic investigation into illegal trade by the MPA. It's not a researcher. And then this is actually one that one of the institutions has dealt with, but a tissue sample from the holotype of a coelacanth for whole genome sequencing. And that's a request from a researcher in a very good lab in Paris. Then someone asks for all the unidentified long-tongued flies in the collection. And this is not a scientist, a citizen scientist, but some expertise in the family. And he wants him to go to his home. So those, we're going to do a poll on that. And then we're also going to look at some other kinds of requests. So someone says, please, can I come to your institution? I want to take tissue samples from all the rhino horns in the collection. And this is for a company who's doing research on the development of synthetic horns for the market. And then someone says, can I come to your herbarium? I want to study the succulents. And that's somebody from overseas. And then somebody also says, can I have your data? Can I have all the spider collection data? And this is an honors project, and we're looking at hotspots of diversity for spiders. Another option, another request, someone wants all your spider data, and this is a researcher from another museum, and they want to select the specimens to request on loan. So they're asking for your whole data set. Then someone says, can I have all your SARCAD data? It's a research project. So someone no one's ever heard of. And then the final difficult request would be a herbarium specimen data set. So they want all your herbarium data. Please, can I have all your data? You can take out the sensitive species data, that's fine. And it's for an EIA consultant. So we've actually got two polls that Pulu set up for us. Pulu, you can open the poll. And let's just have a look there, and everyone can vote. So you can see it there. So you can say, pretend you're the collection manager, and you have to make a decision. Do you approve or do you decline? So we'll give you a few minutes. We'll track the submission. And you can start. It should be accessible now.
Okay, it looks like most people have answered. So I'm going to end on share.
Yeah, let's have a look what people have said. See if there's diversity in opinion, or if everyone has a common thinking about this. Okay, so interesting. First one, some people said, so 42% said they'd approve that request. A lot of people said they'd decline. Interesting. Then the type specimens to go to America. Wow, everyone said no. Nearly everyone. Yeah, everyone said no. Okay, good. Then topad clips from the Cape Parrots, 68% said yes. And 32% said no. Interesting that there's a split there. Tissue sampling from the holotype. So 74% said yes. And I think that tissue sample sending to them was approved. Then all the unidentified long-tongued flies. So most people said they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't accept that. That's interesting. Okay. You can see that there was only consistency in the answers for that one, and that was sending the bats to America. Yeah, I think there's a good chance you won't ever get your bats back, because bats carry all kinds of diseases in America. They're quite paranoid. Okay, so let's open the second poll. This one was more about the data requests. I think it may be a little bit simpler. And here, okay, this is visitors and data requests. So you can answer, you approve or decline for these.
Okay, I'm closing the poll.
Okay, let's have a look and see what people would recommend for these requests. Okay, so for the rhino horn, some people think it's fine, but most people said no. You'd have to do some research, I think. Can you come study the succulents? Okay, so 81% said, yeah, that's fine, you can come. And some said no. It would be interesting to find out why some people said no. I mean, succulents are being hammered by illegal collecting. There might be some issues around that. Somebody wants, this honest student wants all the collection data. Most people said that's fine, you can have the data. Some people said no. And then for a researcher, yes, you can have all our data to select specimens to request a loan. So most people think that's fine. And then for the SciCAD data, so nobody's heard of this person before. I think it's probably 2 out of 32 people said, yes, you can come. Oh, we'll give you all the SciCAD data. But most people said no, because SciCADs are also illegally poached. And then for the last one, the herbarium specimen data set. So some people, 21 people, said they would give the whole data set. They'd remove the sensitive species data and then they'd give the rest to the consultant. But there's also some people who said no, 11. Okay, so that's very interesting. And what you can see there is that we don't all agree. We don't all have the same kind of thinking for this. So how do we deal with this? Where there's many different perspectives and opinions. I think that there's a couple of key things to think about when you're considering an access request. So is the request at a recognized institution? Do they have a track record of research in the field? And if the answer to both of those is yes, then it's usually quite easy. But you also have to think about what are they asking for? So are there any limitations on the material or the data? So sensitive species data, if it's material that someone else in your, someone else is working on it, so then it might be a bit more difficult. And then what do they want to do with the material? And is there any risk of from what they want to do to the scientific integrity of the collection? So what do they want to do? Do they just want to look at it, measure it? Or do they want to cut it up? What do they want to do? So as soon as you have any concerns on those 4 points, then you might need to consult guidelines, or you might need to consult other people. Any decision that's made must be authorized by a senior person at the institution. So it shouldn't be left to one person to approve or decline, and that's it. That's the final decision. It must be signed off. And feedback must be provided to the requester if the request is declined. So you must tell them why you can't give them that. And there must be an appeals process, and the manual gives a lot of detail about what kind of appeals process you should have. And that gives requesters an opportunity to come back if they don't agree with the decision. So I've put all these cartoon kind of pictures of a variety of characters who might be requesting material. And the thing is that it's not easy to identify somebody who might want to do something wrong just by looking at people. And it's not easy to tell whether somebody's credible just by what they look like. And that's why you need very clear criteria. When you decline access, it must be not based on your own judgment of what you think about somebody. It must be based on a written criteria and written guidelines. So that's why it's very important to have that set of documents. And it's also really important that that any access request is made in writing on a standard form, and it must include all the relevant details that you need to make a decision. So there's an example of an access request form in the manual, and these forms should really be on the institution's website. So if somebody's looking, how do I ask for a loan? How do I ask for permission? They can actually get that form. And then there should be a response to the request. You don't have to make the decision, but you must acknowledge receipt, and that must be quick. And give an estimate of how long it'll take before you can give them a decision. So it must be like a very professional process. So that's general access. Those are general rules and guidelines about access, and having all your documents in place just about access is important. But then what do we do about visitors? So visitors to the collection for research purposes. And I think most institutions do actually have rules or guidelines for visitors working in the collection, advising them how to handle specimens, how to dispose of waste, including chemicals, how they should make changes to identifications, or if they want to add any notes. Obviously, the health and safety rules, so it should be there in the visitor guidelines, but they might also need to be shown, evacuation routes, anything else that's important. The rules should also include the opening and closing times, and the visitor should really sign an acknowledgement of those rules. And those rules should also go onto the institution's website. And then you need to have documented information about what will happen if the visitor doesn't abide by the rules. So what process will be followed? And that's, it's important to know what will you do and not to have to make a decision when something happens. And then to say visitors must be provided with a good working environment. I know there was quite a lot of debate about this when they did the manual, the working group, Is it realistic to expect these things? But it is. These are the people that are the clients, and they should have a good working environment with a chair, a workspace, internet connection, a good microscope, and then all the little things that they might need, petri dishes and forceps, dissecting kits, gloves, any other PPEs that they might need, paper, so anything, just think about what they might need. And then there should be someone available to help visitors and to keep an eye on what they're doing. So there's lots of details in the manual about the rules for visitors, but the important thing is to actually have that visitors book and then to have your guidelines or rules for visitors. So loans, so visitors are one thing because they're in your institution and you can keep an eye on them and kind of manage them much better. Loans, and this is where most of our access is through loans, but it is difficult. And there'll be the general access policy and access standards, but then when it comes to loans, it's actually quite a complicated process, and there are workflows that are needed. So it's important to document each step in the process. There should be a workflow or a process for approving loan requests, and then also for selecting the specimens, for documenting or imaging these, for recording any damage. And then also you need someone to verify which specimens are going out and the inventory of those, packaging, postage, loan tracking, reminders and extensions, processing returned loans. So there should be workflows for these different processes, whether you have 3 or 4 or 1, it doesn't matter, but each step-by-step action should be included. And it should say who is responsible for each step, and then what are the time frames for each step. So how long should it take between those different steps? So this is just an example. So you can have a document that's got listed steps in point form, that's fine. Sometimes it's really nice to use a workflow like this because it is so much easier to follow, and you can color code who's responsible for different steps here. So that was for dealing with requests, the authorization process. But then when you're actually going to, the loan has been approved, and there's a whole list of things that need to happen. And different people might be involved in selecting the specimens. There'll be somebody else who will verify your list against what's actually going out. There might be someone else who's packing up the specimens. and doing the packaging, weighing, organizing the labels on the outside of the package, and dispatching the package. And there might be somebody else who's responsible for filing all the documents. So it is a complicated process. It really needs to be well documented and clear who does what. So loan documents in the manual, it gives details. So it's not just a loan form. So there should be that loan agreement that's signed by the requester and the sender, and it should be authorized by somebody, and it should include the conditions of the loan. So what can they do with the specimens? What can't they do? The guidelines for re-identifications. Can they dissect? What are, if they can, what are the requirements? And then how should the specimens be stored while they're out on loan? What are the requirements for returning the loan? How should it be packaged? How should it be posted? Who should it be addressed to? And what documents should come back with it? And then there should also be a place for the person to sign to say that they received the loan, and then also when the loan was sent and by which service. And then there's the loan invoice, and this is like really just a summary information, details of the requester, the sender, the date sent, the due date for return, the type of specimens, how many, and instructions for return of the documents. So which documents must they sign and return? Which ones must they keep? And then there's the full loan inventory. This is a list of specimens with their catalog number, their identity. You might want to put more information, but this is a minimum, and how many individuals if you've got a bottle full of things. And there should be notes on the conditions and any restriction on any individual specimen. So if there's a, might be a type, it can be flagged, can't dissect, can't subsample. So there's a lot of paperwork there. And in the manual, there's lots of guidelines for how do you package specimens. There's step-by-step guidelines for wet specimens, for herbarium specimens. There's also standards for the packaging material, but you need to think about what's relevant for your institution and for the types of specimens that you deal with, and make sure that you have that documented. How do you pack up? What material can you use? And then for posting, what are your standards for posting? Must it be couriered? If it goes through the post office, must it be tracked? And how do you file all those documents, the tracking number, the tracking documents, everything? So packaging is there's a lot of detail in how to do that, and it must be done properly. So here's just some examples, insects and cross-pinning insects so that they don't come loose. These are the wet specimens, and showing, I think there's a demonstration in the manual about fish from SIAB. There's how to pack herbarium specimens. It tells you what labels to put on the outside of the box and how to put what documents into a plastic sleeve that goes on the outside. So all of that information is in the manual. And it is really critically important. I mean, I can remember, I'm not an entomologist, but I did do surveys and I did collect insects that were pinned, and I packed them all nicely in a box. And then someone put a mothball in there in the corner. And by the time it got to where it was going, that mothball had been like a pinball machine just shooting around the box, destroying all the specimens. So every detail is really important to follow. So you also have to think about when loans come back, when they're returned. So that shouldn't be recoding, it's recording the parcel when it arrives. So as soon as it comes in, it must be recorded as having been coming into the institution. And then in the manual, it says within 3 days that parcel must be unpacked. They shouldn't pile up in the corner. So within 3 days. Check each specimen against the inventory. You can note any damage, and you can see whether it's new damage or old damage. You've got your images. So the manual also recommends that before specimens go out on loan, they are imaged. So you've got a record of what they looked like before. There must be an independent verifier also to check and sign off on the list against the specimens. So to check that everything did come back. And then for insects and dry collections that have gone out on loan, there must be decontamination or fumigation, including the packaging. And then the requester who's returned the loan must be sent notice. Yes, we've received it, we've checked it, everything's there, the loan has now been closed. And all those loan documents that were for when the loan went out, it must be recorded that it's come back now and it's closed, and it can also be done on the database. And you might need to to update identifications in the database. You might need to put the specimens into a different place if they've been re-identified. And there should have been a specimen tracking slip when you remove the specimen, and that once it goes back, that can be removed. So there's also a whole process, and there should be a workflow for returned loans. So there's lots of documents. I think that's become evident, and a careful document management system is really essential. You've got to reconcile what went out and what came back. There should be a loan tracking system, and that might be on your database. And all of this can all be stored in Specify or Brahms, so you can scan all the documents and link them to the loan. But if you've got hard copy documents, they should also be filed, and in a very organized way. So that's the access to specimens, but what about access to data and images? This is the same as any other. There must be a process for it. There also should be an access request form completed for any data or image requests. And there should be an agreement that goes out with the data and images, so what can be done with them, and if you require acknowledgement. And then just to say here that if you publish your data to GBIF, make it openly accessible, you don't have to manage it from there. Anybody can download it and use it, and GBIF has rules about acknowledgement if you use any data, but it will relieve a lot of pressure from the collection staff. So you can redact or remove certain fields for sensitive species, but then it's out there and anyone can use it. And the same with making specimen images available online. So instead of having to manage requests every time somebody wants to get an image, if they're out there online, then it simplifies your life. This is a tricky one, destructive sampling. So more and more institutions are being asked for tissue samples for DNA analysis. So it's increasing, and the loans of specimens is decreasing. And so increasingly, there's going to be difficult decisions that have to be made. Because it's different to a loan, because the tissue is usually not returned. So it's more of a donation. And if you subsampling specimens in your collection, it can have a negative effect on those specimens. So if you keep taking bits of them off, obviously the scientific value is declining. So there needs to be much more care for decision-making for destructive sampling. And here you have to really consider the value of each specimen. So is it a very rare specimen? Would it be very difficult to replace it? What's its type status? And then also think about the proposed research. So how important is it? So whole genome sequencing of the coelacanth type is a really important piece of work that needs to be done. And so it is justified. And also think about the extent of impact on the specimen or the collection, how much material is being asked for, how many specimens. Consider the expertise of the requester and the facilities and the funding available. So if it's a top lab somewhere with a very experienced person, researcher who's got access to good funding, then it would be less of an issue than if those things weren't there. So there are a set of standards for destructive sampling in the manual, and each institution should have their standards and their guidelines for helping to make decisions. And you also need to think about what will you allow the requester to do with any remaining tissue or DNA extracted. Can they pass it on to someone else? Can they keep it in their collection? Must they return it? Must they destroy it? And those are really important points to have and to communicate to the requester. So to finish off, providing access to the collections and data and images is one of the main functions of collection institutions. So at the same time, we have to recognize that all three of these things are assets. So if you work in an institution for government, you know about asset management and how you have to track the movement of every single thing that's on the asset register, small and big. These are assets too. So they must be managed like other assets, but there's a bit of a difference because they have to be used, and often by external users. So that is a risk, but the risks have to be managed, and that's usually by having guidelines and policies. And a big thing is to record everything, to keep records of everything, and to keep those records in a very organized system. And to recognize then that there's also complex decision making. So sometimes it's not easy to know whether you should approve or decline a request, but whatever you do must be transparent. It must be very clear why you made that decision. It must be fair, so everybody is treated in the same way at first. But if you decline, it's not because of a personal agenda or a personal conflict. It's because of very clear criteria. And there must always be appropriate authorization. So if you think about audit requirements and asset management, there's always a requester and an approver. And that's the same for loans, or sending out data, or sending images, or even allowing a visitor into the collection. And then just a final point, it's, when you see all of the work involved with loans and visitors, you might think, oh, it's so much easier to just not have any of these people here or to do these things. But the users of the collections are valued clients. Without them, the collection won't have any value. So valued clients, and they must be treated professionally like any client would expect to be treated. All right, so I think that's the end of the webinar. Next week, we will be having, I think it will be next week, but we'll confirm the discussion forum, and we'll be talking a bit more about the access. If anybody would like to present, you are very, very welcome to do that. We'd like presentations for the discussion forum. And it can be anything related to access. So loans, images, your policy, your document management, tracking, how you package things, how you unpack things, any sort of presentation on those types of access related matters. So you can always let me know as soon as possible if you're willing to give a presentation. And then at the discussion forum, we'll also be talking about some of the tricky, difficult questions around access. I know it is something that does get people into quite heated debate. Okay, so I think I'll end there. Thanks, everybody. I don't know if there are any questions. Okay, well, I think if there's nothing, then we can close the webinar. And just to say thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We will put out the assignment for this webinar topic next week, and the one from webinar 12, the one on accessioning and de-accessioning, is also up. I'll just ask Fulu to circulate that. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.